Hey folks, my name is Adam Schmutte. Thanks for joining us here with our first Instagram Live event of Earth Week. I'm the Urban Naturalist Manager at KIB, and today we are right along Fall Creek, if you can see behind me, on the north end of Fall Creek and 30th Park in the Mapleton Fall Creek neighborhood. So today I'm going to be talking to you guys a little bit about invasive species, about some ID tips, and a little bit about how to control them, since a lot of us seem to have a lot of time on our hands to work in our yards. So, if you guys have any questions as we're going, if you guys want to use the little question mark icon at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions, I'll do my best to answer those as we go along. If I don't get to them right away, I'll try and get to them at the end before I sign off. But feel free to use that, say hello. Thanks to the 4 of you guys, 5, that have joined us so far. But before we get started on some tips on how to ID invasive plants, I wanted to make sure that you all first knew what an invasive species was. So here in Indianapolis, in an urban area, we don't have to look very far to find them. But an invasive species, specifically an invasive plant, is a plant that is not native to where it is currently found. So plants that are not native to here in Indianapolis would be considered invasive if they cause economic, environmental, or harm to human health in some way. So essentially, these plants are not native. They've been introduced, whether that be on purpose or an accident, and they have to cause some kind of harm. So some of the ones that you guys might be familiar with, like Asian bush honeysuckle is a big one around here. We'll talk about that one a little bit today. We're also going to talk about purple winter creeper and garlic mustard specifically. Those are some that I've been dealing with in my own backyard that I inherited when we moved recently. So I figured right now would be a good time to tackle those and a good time to talk about them. Let's see if I can flip this around here. All right. So first off, we've got garlic mustard. As you can see, I've already pulled one up here at this site. I'm in the riparian corridor right now. But here at this site, we've got a couple of planting projects full of native plants that our urban naturalists worked to create over the last few years. And this was actually in the bed, so I went ahead and pulled it. Garlic mustard is an invasive biennial, meaning that its life cycle takes place over the course of 2 years. So if you think about plants that are annuals, geraniums and stuff that you plant every year, those are having their entire life cycle over the course of 1 year. Perennials have multiple years, meaning they'll come back every year for a given period of time. Biennials have 2-year life cycles. So the first year, they'll come up and they'll have usually what's called a basal rosette. It won't quite look like this on garlic mustard. It's a little bit more compact, close to the ground. So this is a year 2 where it's actually flowering. You can see, hopefully if I can get this to focus, those little white flowers there are characteristic of garlic mustard. Right now, from what I'm seeing out here and around Indianapolis, they're just starting to flower or have been flowering for a little bit, but I'm not seeing any of them go to seed so far, which is really good. We want to make sure that we can tackle this invasive before it goes to seed. But some other tips on IDing this plant. It's got around the base, you can see those kind of more heart-shaped leaves. They're serrated slightly, and as you get farther up the plant, those leaves get a little pointier. Trying to do my best to let you guys see that. But those particular plants, those leaves, are characteristic of that second year stage, like this one where it's flowering. So they're easiest to identify when they're in that second stage. But the easiest way to identify both the first year and the second year stage is when if you rip off a leaf, kind of crush it in your hands a little bit like that, and smell it, it's going to smell like garlic, hence the name garlic mustard. So that is your surefire way to tell if this is garlic mustard. Find a plant that looks remotely like this, give it the smell test, and you can see if that's the plant you're looking for. This one is most easily controlled if you've got it in your yard just by hand pulling. But you want to make sure that you get that entire root like I've done here. If you leave any of that behind, it will come back the following year. and then you're going to continue to have this problem. And like I said a little bit earlier, you want to try and do your best to catch them before they go to seed, because if you let them go to seed, obviously you're going to have new plants on your hands. So if you work on that a little bit, stay ahead of the curve, you can get this plant under control relatively easily, especially on your own property. By controlling these plants on your property, they help us control them in these natural areas like this riparian corridor. So that's kind of probably the gist of garlic mustard. Like I mentioned, that first year basil rosette is a little harder to identify if you're not used to looking at it. It does have those characteristic leaves that are a little more like this at the base, but oftentimes it's smaller. But because it's a biennial, if you don't get all of those first year plants this year, next year they will come back with those flowers and you'll be able to identify them a little bit better, and then you can get them next year. So that first year they won't go to seed, so they're not going to be creating any new plants for you to work with. Once you've pulled this, you do want to put it in a trash bag, and make sure you take it away. Sometimes these have a tendency to go ahead and still get pollinated or continue to produce seeds even if they're already out of the ground. They're tenacious little plants. So make sure that you throw that in a trash bag and dispose of it properly. I'm going to set this one down here for the time being and get that on my way out. We've got a couple more here. This one is in its flowering stage. So is this one too. It just hasn't flowered yet, but that's kind of what you want to be looking for. We've got them a little bit out here, but that is one that I've been controlling in my own yard. And now is a great time to control them in yours just because they are pretty easy to identify right now and they have not yet gone to seed. So that's garlic mustard. If anyone has any questions, feel free to just chime in with that little question button at the bottom of your screen. I figured next we could move on to purple winter creeper, which is another one that is all over the place here in Indianapolis. It's a big one in the Midwest. But this plant is also pretty good to control right now, just because right now we're seeing a lot of that new growth. So you're going to be noticing it a little bit more than maybe you would previously, just because right now is the time of year where it's growing rapidly. So purple winter creeper, let's see if I can get this turned around again. Here's an example of it on this tree. Purple winter creeper was actually introduced into the ecosystems here by accident through the landscaping and nursery industry. It was a plant that was cultivated in horticulture for a really long time and marketed as a fast-growing, resistant ground cover, which it very much is. If you were to look in a lot of these natural areas, you'll see it all over the ground. Unfortunately, in this particular area, we have traded one invasive ground cover for another. So there's patches of this purple winter creeper here that are carpeting, and then we've got part of this ranunculus here that is a lot more difficult to control and isn't quite as common in people's yards as purple winter creeper is. So we aren't going to talk too much about that today. But this particular plant, a lot of people might have it in your yard still being planted on purpose, or you did originally plant it on purpose. This plant is actually now, as of the 18th, illegal to buy, sell, trade, barter with the terrestrial plant rule, which is really, really awesome for us in terms of controlling this plant. If people are still selling it and planting it, that means there's all kinds of new introductions that can occur that are going to potentially create more problems for us in these natural areas. So by combating this again at home first, you guys can help us be the first line of defense to making sure that this doesn't escape into our natural areas. So like I said, this is kind of a creeping vine. It's evergreen to an extent. Let's see if I can peel this off of here. It's going to come off piece by piece. Anyway, evergreen, that's part of the reasons why people often liked it when they were growing it intentionally. But the darker green colors that you see here are older growth. All of this light green kind of branching is newer growth. So this plant, like I mentioned, this time of the year, this is rapid growth going on right now. So it's a good time to notice it and catch it before it starts getting too wild again on you. But another control tip for this one is that it only produces seed when it climbs a tree or some other vertical structure like this. So the plants don't reach maturity to produce seed unless they've gone vertical. So if you've got this on the ground, great. Then you're not producing any seed. It can still spread kind of along that ground otherwise. But if you are keeping it from producing seed, that is step one into controlling this invasive species. So if you've got this particular plant wrapping around any trees or your fence in your backyard, that is where you want to start with controlling it. So first, if you are trying to get it off of something growing vertical, like I'm doing here with little success, sometimes they peel off a little bit easier than others. But basically, you want to stop that vertical growth. So if it's a small vine like this, you can just peel it off by hand or kind of scrape it gently with a tool. So this would be the demo here. If you've got a really mature vine that's very large, here, that came off nicely. If you got a mature vine, what you'd want to do was cut it down low at the base. So if your vine was here, I'm not seeing any super large ones out here, which is great, but you would cut that vine that you couldn't peel off without damaging the tree, kind of cut a slice into it, and then you would treat that lower end with herbicide. You could use a lot of different kinds of herbicides for that cut stump treatment on this vine. Things like glyphosate, triclopyr works really well. Consult the label on your herbicides before doing anything like that. But those would be the best ways to control that base. So you'd want to make sure you could kill that root mass. Out here, this one's still small, so I was just able to pull it up and get it off of that tree. So this particular one won't be producing any seeds this year, which is awesome. But let's see, I'll turn this around again. So that's kind of like I mentioned, that first step. If you've got a massive amount covering the ground in your yard, which I just did when we moved in back in June, my whole fence line in the back was kind of carpeted with this stuff. So we spent the last few days last week just ripping it all up by hand, trying to get as much of the roots as possible. And then my plan is to continue to maintain that after I replant it with native plants. And I'll just kind of hand pull anything that grows back. If I can't control it that way, then I will treat some of those stumps with herbicide. But none of mine had too many mature plants of the purple winter creeper, so I think that hopefully my method would be sufficient. If you're controlling it in a natural area like this and it's a really dense infestation, you're going to want to use a foliar kind of spray treatment with herbicide. So we would be out here with a backpack sprayer, treating it with an oil-based application. Since these leaves, I'll show you guys really quick, they are really kind of waxy and thick. So that waxy kind of leaf margin is hard for chemicals to penetrate without an extra kind of additive. So something to get that oil to stick on there a little bit better, help penetrate those leaves. But that would be the first step. So just to recap with purple winter creeper, you'd want to pull it off of anything climbing or cut it so that it's not producing new seeds and new plants. And then you can focus on the ground, either hand pulling or treating with pesticides or herbicides rather. But on this particular plant, some of these leaves are a little smaller than I'd like to show you, but this one's a little bit better. They're pretty glossy. Like I mentioned, the dark ones are a lot darker green. The newer ones are bright green. They'll kind of darken up as the season goes on, but they are also slightly toothed on that leaf edge, so a little bit serrated there. And then in the winter, kind of hence the name purple winter creeper, the leaves do turn kind of a purplish red hue. We're a little past that now. You can kind of see it on the underside of this guy there, if I can get this to focus. Anyway, that's kind of the ID tips on that one. So you'd want to focus on pulling that off first and then working on the ground. In a backyard, it's a lot easier to take care of these than in a natural area. So those were two of the three species we wanted to talk about really quick. Does anyone have any questions yet? I don't think I've gotten any questions so far. Let me check. Cool. Like I said, yeah, those were the two species we wanted to touch on first, two that I've been controlling in my own yard. The last being Asian bush honeysuckle, which I'm sure most people are super familiar with. I don't have to look very far to find that one here. Here's a good plant. This is probably one of the most pervasive invasive species that we deal with here in Indianapolis, and that my team, the Urban Naturalist, deals with in any of our sites. Most of our volunteer events are focused on Asian bush honeysuckle. It's probably present at every single site that we work at. So this one is a rough one, and a lot of people have this in their property, just kind of growing as a weed as well. If you have any kind of unmanaged area that's untended to, you'll likely have this. Some people might even still have it that they're unknowingly trimming into a hedge. So this plant right now is usually early in the spring. It's one of the first shrubs to leaf out. Right now, everything is kind of leafed out, so we've lost that ID tip advantage. But it has these opposite leaves, so along a stem, the leaves will be growing opposite one another. We're starting to see on this one the flower buds forming. I think you guys can see that right at where that leaf connects to the stem. And those leaves, unlike the other two species I showed you, these ones are not serrated at all. They're smooth and kind of taper off into a teardrop shape. But the bark is a good way to tell this time of the year if you're not certain. It's kind of got this vertical striping on it. If you guys can see that a little bit there, these stripes go up and down. All of its branching is going to be opposite. And then the easiest way to tell with lookalikes is if you snap that any of the branches, twigs, kind of stems off of this plant, they're all going to be hollow like this. So that middle part where a pith would be in a lot of shrubs, these are hollow. I'm not sure if you guys can see that, but there's some native dogwood species that look quite similar to Asian bush honeysuckle. Those are not hollow. So if you're uncertain, just like with the garlic mustard, if you're not sure about all the other tips on how to ID that plant, you could smell it. This one, you can break it off and see if it's hollow. If you are not certain that it is not a native species before you break it off, I recommend starting small with one of the smaller branches, and then work your way up to the big one if you can't tell, before you just break off a whole limb of that plant. This one is a species that seeds very rapidly, and they don't have to be too old to start producing seed. So this one down here, we can see the stump. If I were treating this right now at this site to control it, or if this was in my yard, you could pull up this entire plant by the roots or dig it out, but that's a lot of work. What I would recommend is to cut as low as you could on that stump with a saw, and then treat that stump with a 50% concentration solution of glyphosate herbicide right there at the base of that. You can that way make sure you're controlling the amount of herbicide you're using. You're limiting it. You're putting it on a very specific site, so you don't have to use a ton of it. And then you're going to make sure if you do that within a half hour of cutting that, don't wait too long. But if you do within that half hour, you're going to see the most effective treatment. Sometimes you might have to retreat any growth that might come back or spring back, but it might just take another time or two. But my recommendation for controlling honeysuckle, if it's large, would be to cut that at the base and then to treat it with herbicide and just get rid of that brush. If you've got really small plants, you can just pull those out with your hands. But other than that, if they're more mature, I would recommend just cutting them down and then treating it. That's a surefire way to make sure you've killed it. Oh, awesome. Aaron's got, just found some, I guess not awesome, at his parents' house 15 minutes ago. Not ideal, but not an uncommon situation. Like I said, I've been controlling this and the other two species in my own yard, trying to work to get all of those invasives out and get it re-landscaped with natives is the goal. So that's kind of the rundown with honeysuckle. If no one has any questions with that, we can move on. If you find yourself treating this at a different time of the year, flowers are another good way to tell. They're usually a whitish cream yellow color on the end of that stem there. People are pretty familiar with those. And then later in the summer and into the fall, they'll have the red berries. So we can kind of, if I can gather up my invasives I've pulled here really quick. And we can make our way up the hill to a planting project the Urban Naturalist worked on for several years that was full of a bunch of different invasive species and is now a thriving native landscape. One sec, I think we've got a question. Maurice asked if cutting is ineffective if you don't have herbicide at the time. So if you just cut it and don't treat it with herbicide, I wouldn't say it's ineffective. You're still going to knock a bunch of that plant back. You're likely going to reduce its ability to create seed that year. It might have to start over. So you're going to definitely set that plant back. But if you give it that herbicide after you've cut it, you're kind of hitting it with that 1-2 punch. So you'll be making sure that with that herbicide that will actually kill the plant. If you just cut it, that plant won't die, but it can give you a little more time to set it back and then hopefully get herbicide, come back and treat it another time, and you can just redo that process. So good question, Maurice. I wouldn't say it's completely ineffective, but you won't kill that plant without herbicide or digging up the roots entirely. Good question. So I'm going to flip the camera around here again really quick. We're here at the intersection of Fall Creek and 30th Street. Just up the riverbank from where I was talking to you guys earlier. I know it doesn't look like much right now since these plants are just starting to poke through, but this north slope of the bridge and this kind of prairie area a couple of years ago were full of nothing but invasive species. My Urban Naturalist teams from 2017 on worked to control this site. It took many, many years to get it into shape to where we felt comfortable planting something that would be successful. But now, if you come back in a few months, this place is going to be a beautiful, thriving, diverse native plant oasis. So, we can just take a quick look. I know this might be for my own enjoyment than yours. But right now, we've got some mountain mint starting to grow up. This will be a little bit denser and taller when it's fully leafed out and kind of grown in from the spring. But this particular plant smells amazing. As the name would suggest, it's in the mint family. It's edible. It has beautiful white flowers that I think are beautiful anyway. They're pretty delicate. But this plant is also an absolute pollinator magnet. So it's one of my favorite native plants. It's here. It's a really good option if you can get your hands on it to add to your landscape at home if you've got a full sun palette. We've also got some wild columbine coming up here, which will have really beautiful red and yellow flowers. But we've got, I think, between this site here and then this hillside, 30 to 40 different native species are present that we planted, and we're continuing to steward today. The Urban Naturalist will be actually out here probably within the next few weeks to whip this into shape a little bit for the new season. Got a beautiful red bud flower in here. But like I mentioned before, this was previously nothing but invasive species. Way more than we talked about today, but it was quite a bit of work, but with a lot of attention to those plants, repeated control, and hi Rodolfo, repeated control, and making sure that you're staying vigilant and following up with those treatments, making sure you're using the proper treatments to not harm the landscape. There's a lot that you can accomplish, even if there are still invasive species wherever you're working. So if your yard is full of them right now, don't get discouraged. Like I mentioned, my backyard up until 2 days ago was chock full of almost nothing but invasive plants. And so we've been working on that really hard. And within the next few weeks, I'm going to be planting it all up. So this is really exciting for me to see this project thriving as it is now. It is its second season of bloom and growth. So this will be really cool to see it a little more mature than last summer. But a lot is possible if you control those invasive plants. You can still have a beautiful yard, beautiful landscape, and it is definitely a winnable battle within your own yard. Like I mentioned too, if you can control those in your yard, you're going to be a big help to us controlling them here in the field, in the parks, in these riparian corridors, all throughout the city of Indianapolis. It'll be a huge help if you make sure that you're not buying or planting those plants. And if you have them on your yard already, doing your part to help control those for us, we very much appreciate it. If you have any questions, I can ask or answer those now. If anyone wants to talk about any more of these options here. I think our marketing team is going to post some follow-up photos later this afternoon, if they haven't done it already, with a little more detailed information and photos to reference on those invasive species and some ID tips. If you guys had a harder time checking them out via video, I think that might be a better option of photos to look at to compare to see if you've got those in your property. What are my favorite native plants? It's a good question, Maurice. I mentioned that mountain mint. That is one of my favorite native plants. It smells incredible. I think the flowers are super beautiful, even though they're really, really delicate and just kind of simple. But I really like it mostly because of the diverse array of pollinators that it attracts. All of the milkweeds are beautiful plants. I really enjoy those, especially swamp milkweed and butterfly weed. Of course, those are host to monarch butterflies, which is really awesome. And then I think, let's see, I'm really excited about little blue stem grass. It's my favorite ornamental grass that is a native plant. I would say those are some of my examples right off the top of my head. The list is kind of ever-changing throughout the seasons, so maybe check back in later this summer when things are in bloom. But again, if you guys have any more questions, feel free to ask those now. Otherwise, I'll be wrapping this up here in a few minutes. Make sure you guys stay tuned in with our social media channels. We're going to be doing a lot more different things like this, posting videos about how to create a native plant garden in your own yard, how to maintain stuff like that. We're also going to be doing some educational content throughout the week about litter abatement, adopt-a-block programs, all different kinds of things that KIB can help you out with in your own yard and in your own neighborhood. So make sure you stay tuned to our social media channels. For some of the more detailed resources, go ahead and go to our website, kibi.org / let's see if I get this right, earth day 2020. We'll see size in here. We'll see if I got that right. But if you go to that link, we got a lot more resources for Earth Week going on this week. So make sure you stay tuned. Thanks for joining me here today. I don't think I've got any more questions yet. If I do, I'm just not sure I'm using this right. But like I said, thanks again for joining. Hope you all learned something. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out. We're happy to be a resource, and thank you for taking the time to learn a little bit with me, and I wish you well on your backyard invasive removal projects. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Have a good one.